Some men measure their marriages in anniversaries, in vacations and photographs, and the particular way a woman laughs at your jokes even after she's heard them 40 times. I measure mine differently, without knowing I was doing it. The way you measure a foundation before you understand it's the thing holding everything else up. I measured mine in who showed up and when, and who didn't. My name is Gerald Pruitt. I'm 61 years old. I spent 32 years with the Army Corps of Engineers, retired in 2019 out of the Denver District Office, and I have spent the better part of my adult life assessing structural integrity, bridges, levees, flood walls. You learn, after enough years, that the failure point is never where people expect it to be. It's always somewhere quieter. A hairline fracture under the surface. A load-bearing element nobody thought to inspect. I live in Lakewood, Colorado, in a house I bought in 2004 with a mortgage I paid off 6 years ago. I drive a 2017 Ford F-250 dark green, which Sandra has always said was too much truck for a man with no farm. She's probably right. I keep it anyway. I coach youth wrestling at a rec center on Alameda Avenue on Tuesday evenings because a retired man needs somewhere to put his hands. That is my life. That has always been my life. I am not a complicated person. Welcome to Dad's Raw Revenge. Get settled, because this one's going to take you somewhere. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. You're going to want to be here for this. Let me tell you about Marcus first, because this is his story before it's mine. Marcus Pruitt, my son, is 34 years old. He works as a civil site engineer for a construction firm in Aurora, which did not surprise anyone who knew me, and which he will probably deny is my fault until the day he retires. He lives alone in a 2-bedroom apartment off Colfax Avenue. He runs half marathons. He calls me on Sunday mornings, not because I asked him to, but because at some point in his 20s he decided that's what a son does, and I have never once had to remind him. He is a good man. He is the best thing I have ever been involved in building, and I had considerably less to do with it than I would like to take credit for. Sandra and I have been married 22 years. She is 57, works as an account manager for a commercial real estate firm in downtown Denver, and she is, I want to be precise about this, not a cruel woman. I don't think she's cruel. I think she is a woman who got comfortable, who decided, somewhere in the middle of a long marriage, that presence was optional, that the fact of being someone's wife was sufficient, regardless of what that word required on any given day. I want to be fair about it. I spent 3 decades as a man who was frequently gone, frequently working, frequently thinking about drainage gradients and soil load tolerances instead of whatever was happening at the kitchen table. I know I wasn't easy to be married to. I know that. I am not trying to make her into a villain, because the truth of it is simpler and harder than that. She just stopped showing up, and I stopped noticing how long ago it had started, until the Tuesday in March when Marcus's co-worker called me at 6:19 in the evening, because Marcus had listed me as his emergency contact, and his co-worker was calling from the parking lot of Swedish Medical Center in Englewood, and he told me that Marcus had collapsed on a job site at 4:45 p.m. and had been brought in by ambulance, and I needed to come right away. I was in the kitchen, coffee in my hand, half watching the evening news. I set the mug down on the counter very carefully. I turned the television off. I picked up my jacket from the hook by the garage door, my keys, my phone. I did not call Sandra first. I don't know why. Some part of me knew, I think, without knowing yet what I knew. I drove to Swedish in 21 minutes. Marcus was in emergency surgery when I got there. A nurse named Diane, steady voice, the kind of calm that comes from 20 years of delivering hard news, told me he had suffered a spontaneous aortic dissection. She explained it to me the way you explain something to a person who needs to understand it right now. Not gradually, not gently. A tear in the wall of the main artery. Life-threatening. The surgical team was with him. She would update me as soon as there was something to update. I sat down in the waiting area on a blue vinyl chair under fluorescent lights, and I called Sandra. She picked up on the 4th ring. Gerald, I'm at dinner with Patrice. Can this wait? No, I said. Marcus is in surgery at Swedish. Aortic dissection. I'm here now. A pause. Oh, God. Is he? What does that mean, aortic dissection? It means it's serious, I said. You should come. She came. She arrived at 8:47 p.m., still in her dinner clothes, and she sat beside me for an hour and 40 minutes while we waited. I want to give her that. She came and she sat, and when the surgeon, a man named Dr. Paul Ferenc, came out at 9:31 and told us the surgery had gone well, that Marcus was stable, that they were moving him to the ICU for monitoring, Sandra exhaled and reached over and took my hand. I felt the warmth of that. I registered it. Then her phone buzzed and she looked at it, and her thumb moved across the screen, and I thought, for the first time in a long time, about what it means to actually be somewhere. Marcus was in the ICU at Swedish Medical Center for 7 days. Sandra visited twice. The first time was Thursday, 2 days after the surgery. She came in the afternoon, stayed for 40 minutes, asked the nurse a few questions about discharge timeline, and left when her parking was about to expire. She kissed Marcus on the forehead. He was barely conscious. He wouldn't remember it. The second time was Friday. She stayed for an hour. She brought flowers, white lilies, which Marcus is mildly allergic to, a fact she's known for a decade, and she held his hand and asked him how he was feeling with the specific attentiveness of someone who was trying to feel attentive rather than someone who simply was. I watched her do it, and I thought about load calculations, about the difference between a structure that can bear weight and one that can only appear to. Friday evening, around 6:30, while Marcus was sleeping and I was refilling my coffee at the family lounge down the hall, Sandra appeared in the doorway with her coat on. Her overnight bag was at her feet. Small roller bag, the one she uses for work trips. I looked at the bag. I looked at her. She said it evenly, the way she said most things. Evenly and without particular emphasis, like she was reading something she'd already proofread. Gerald, I need to get out of the city for the weekend. I can't do hospitals. I have never been able to do hospitals. You know that about me. I do know that about her. She told me when we were dating that hospitals made her feel like the walls were breathing. I had always accommodated it. Marcus is still in the ICU, I said. I know. She met my eyes. He has you, Gerald. He's always had you. That's always been enough. She picked up the bag. She pulled the handle up. She wheeled it toward the elevator. I stood in the hallway with my coffee going cold, and I watched her go. I did not call after her. I did not ask her to stay. Some requests, by the time you realize you'd have to make them, have already answered themselves. I walked back into Marcus's room, sat down in the chair beside his bed, and I watched him breathe. The monitors beeped their small, steady rhythms. The Ford dripped. Outside the window, the Denver evening was going orange at the edges. He has you. I thought about that sentence for a long time. If you have been listening for a while, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Hit the like button while you're at it, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Saturday morning, March 14th, 8:12 a.m. I had slept 4 hours in the chair beside Marcus's bed, which is to say, I had not slept. I had a cup of hospital coffee that tasted like the building's anxiety, and I was watching Marcus's O2 readout the way I used to watch river gauges in flood season. Steady, calm, looking for the number that would tell me whether today was a normal day or a day that required something more. Marcus was awake for stretches now. He looked better than he had. The color was coming back slowly. He asked me Thursday evening where Sandra was, and I told him she had some things to take care of. He nodded and closed his eyes. He was still too tired to push further. I was grateful for that. At 8:22, Douglas Webb walked into the ICU waiting room, carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag. Douglas and I have been friends since 1991. We worked on the same levee assessment team in Mississippi my first year with the Corps. He is 63, retired from the Corps 3 years before I did, and he is by disposition the opposite of a dramatic man. He does not overshare. He does not offer opinions unless you ask for them twice. He communicates primarily through showing up, which in my experience is the only kind of communication that actually costs anything. He set the coffees on the table. He put the bag down. Turkey sandwich for each of us, he said, because you have not eaten anything that didn't come from a machine since Tuesday. He sat down, unfolded the paper bag with the neat precision of a man who had done many things neatly for many years, And he did not ask me where Sandra was. He didn't ask about her at all. Not once in 9 hours. I want you to understand what that meant to me. The careful architecture of that silence. The way a man who has known you for 34 years can communicate everything he has already understood about your situation without saying a single word that would require you to explain it. We sat together in that waiting room. We drank our coffee. We talked about Marcus's surgery, about the engineering of the repair. Because Douglas knew that talking about it structurally helped me manage it emotionally, and he had always known that about me. We talked about the Corps, about a project he'd read about in the journal last month. We sat through the afternoon with the comfortable quiet of men who have shared difficult ground before. At 4:15, Marcus was awake and alert enough to have visitors for 30 minutes. Douglas Webb, who had never stopped being Marcus's honorary uncle, sat at his bedside and told him that his color looked significantly better than the pale shade of concrete he had achieved 2 days ago, which Marcus laughed at, and the laugh caused him something around his sternum, which made him wince, which made me stand up, and Douglas put a hand on my arm and said, "He's fine, Gerald. Sit down." At 6 o'clock, Douglas stood up, put on his jacket, shook my hand. "You need anything?" he said. "I know," I told him. He nodded. He left. I sat with what I had been sitting with since Friday evening. Sandra was in Breckenridge. She had texted me Saturday morning with a photograph of the view from her rental balcony. Snow on the peaks, blue sky. The particular careful framing of someone who wants you to understand they are having a good time. Below the photograph, getting some air, thinking of you both. I looked at that text for a long time. I am not by nature a reactive man. 32 years of federal infrastructure work trains a specific habit of mind. You do not make decisions about a structure in the moment you discover the problem. You assess, you document, you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with before you determine what needs to happen next. Emotional decisions and engineering decisions have one thing in common. The expensive ones are the ones made without complete information. So I sat in the parking lot of Swedish Medical Center at 7:48 p.m. on a Saturday in the front seat of my 2017 Ford F-250, and I opened my phone. I had 3 calls to make. The first was to Robert Stills, my financial advisor of 11 years, a careful, methodical man with an office on South Colorado Boulevard who had helped me structure my retirement assets when I left the Corps. I asked him one question. He answered it. I told him I would call him Monday. The second was to my attorney, a woman named Claire Alderton, 14 years in family law, Denver practice, the kind of attorney who listened more than she spoke and understood the difference between what a client wanted to do and what they needed to do. I had retained her briefly in 2018 for a property matter. I called her personal cell. She answered. I told her what I needed. She asked 2 clarifying questions. She said she could see me Monday at 11. The third call was to the HR benefits line at the Army Corps of Engineers Retired Employee Services. I had the number saved. I had never had occasion to use it for this purpose. The representative's name was Marla. She was professional, patient, and she confirmed for me exactly what I needed to confirm. In the state of Colorado, a beneficiary designation on a federal pension is a legal document, independent of any will, any trust, any verbal understanding between spouses. It supersedes all of them. It can be changed at any time by the account holder. It requires 1 form and 1 signature. Marla emailed me the form at 8:09 p.m. I sat in the parking lot of the hospital where my son was recovering from a surgery that might have killed him, and I filled out that form on my phone. Name, account number, beneficiary to be removed, beneficiary to be designated. I read it twice. I signed it electronically at 2:47 p.m., the timestamp read Mountain Time. My phone must have lagged on the update, and I submitted it. Then I sat there for a moment. I thought about 22 years, about the mortgage paid off, about Sunday morning calls from my son, about the particular sound of an empty ICU waiting room, and a man who drove from Lilton on a Saturday morning with 2 coffees and a turkey sandwich without being asked. I thought about He Has You. I started the engine and drove back inside. Sunday was a quiet day at the hospital. Marcus slept through most of it. His O2 numbers were stable. Dr. Ferenc came by at 10:30, reviewed his chart, told me his recovery was progressing well, and that he was looking at a Thursday discharge if the numbers held. He shook my hand with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done his job correctly. I ate my lunch from the cafeteria at the table by the window, watching the parking lot below. The mountains were clear to the west, white and absolute. The kind of day that reminds you Colorado is beautiful even when you are not in a position to enjoy it. Sandra texted at 2:14. "How is he today?" "Stable," I said. "Better." "Good. That's good. Nothing else." I set my phone face down on the table and finished my lunch. Monday morning, March 16th. Sandra came home at 11 a.m. I was at Claire Alderton's office on Grant Street at 11, which meant I was not there when Sandra arrived. I got home at 12:47 to find her in the kitchen, making a salad with the practiced ease of a woman who had not done anything she needed to account for. She looked up when I came in. "How is he today?" "Good," I said. "They think Thursday for discharge." She nodded. "That's such a relief." She set down the knife. "Gerald, I want you to know I feel terrible about the weekend. I just genuinely could not. The hospital environment. It takes something out of me. You know that. But I've been thinking about him constantly." "I know you have," I said. I hung up my jacket. I got myself a glass of water. I stood at the counter, and I drank it. She was watching me, looking for the argument, for the cold shoulder, the pointed silence, the specific withdrawal behavior of a husband who had been sitting on resentment since Friday night. I had given her that before, over smaller things. She knew the shape of it. I didn't give it to her. I said, "I have a meeting with Claire Alderton on Wednesday. You should probably have your own attorney review some things before then." She went still. "Who is Claire Alderton?" She asked. "Family law attorney," I said. "Grant Street office." I refilled my glass. Sandra stood at the kitchen counter with her knife in her hand and the salad half made, and I watched something move across her face in the same sequence. I have watched structures respond to load since 1987. First the weight of the information, then the assessment of what it means, then the small visible shift of a thing that has been relying on a support it suddenly understands is no longer where it was. "Gerald," she said. Her voice was careful. "What did you do?" I looked at her. I thought about the parking lot at Swedish, about Marla's careful voice on the benefits line, about Claire Alderton's 2 clarifying questions, and the particular quality of her listening. "Nothing irreversible yet," I said, "but I have been doing some assessing." That is the word I used. Assessing. She set the knife down. She said, "This is because of the weekend." I said, "Sandra, it is not because of the weekend. And I want to be honest about that, because it is important that I am honest about it. It was not because of the weekend. The weekend was the point at which I finally looked clearly at something I had been not looking at for a long time. The weekend was the levee finally failing. But the erosion had been happening for years. I thought about Marcus's first surgery in 2016, when he had his appendix out at 3 a.m. on a Wednesday, and Sandra had not come to hospital because she had a board presentation the next morning. About Thanksgiving 2019, my first Thanksgiving retired, when my mother was ill in Colorado Springs and I had driven down alone because Sandra had other plans. About the specific architecture of a marriage where one person always has other plans and the other person has always quietly covered for it. "He has you. That's always been enough." She had been saying that sentence in various forms for years. I had been accepting it. That was not her fault alone. I had been complicit in the accounting. I said, "I need you to get an attorney, Sandra, not as a threat, as information. I want you to have someone in your corner who is advising you correctly." She looked at me for a long time. Then she went very quiet, picked her phone up from the counter, walked past me into the living room, and sat down on the couch. I could hear, a few minutes later, the low murmur of her making a call. I did not listen. I finished my glass of water, put the glass in the sink, and drove back to the hospital. Marcus came home Thursday, March 19th, 10:23 a.m. I had arranged everything. His apartment wasn't practical for recovery, so I cleared the downstairs guest room of my house in Lakewood and set it up the way I would have set up a recovery suite on a job site. Everything within reach, nothing that required unnecessary movement. A clear path from the bed to the bathroom, a small table with water and medication, and his phone charger. Practical and complete. I signed his discharge paperwork at 9:47. Dr. Ferinch gave me his personal line and told me the parameters, activity restrictions, symptoms to watch for, follow-up cardiology on the 26th. He shook my hand again. He had no one in that room but me at discharge. I want you to hold that detail. I drove Marcus home in the F-250. He sat in the passenger seat with his jacket zipped and his hands in his lap, looking out at the March morning. Denver was doing the thing it does in late winter. Bright sky, cold air, snow on the mountains visible from the highway. Marcus watched it for a while without speaking. He said, "Dad." "Yeah, where's Sandra?" I kept my eyes on the road. "She's at the house." "She wasn't at the discharge." "No," I said. "She wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Is everything okay between you two?" I thought about how to answer that. Thought about 32 years of assessing things honestly, of writing reports that said what they said without softening what needed to be said. We're working through some things. I told him. He looked at me. His face is a lot like mine. He processes things internally before he says them, which drives people who don't know him a little crazy, and which I understand completely. He said, "What kind of things?" "The kind that take a while," I said. He nodded slowly. Looked back out the window. We drove the rest of the way in the comfortable silence that Marcus and I have been developing since he was about 14 years old. The silence of two people who understand each other well enough that they don't need to fill the space. The guest room was ready when we got there. He lowered himself onto the bed carefully, and I could see how much the discharge process had cost him, the effort being upright and functional when his body was still rebuilding itself. I got him water. I went through the medications. I checked the phone charger was plugged in. I was pulling the door half closed when he said, "Dad." "Yeah." He was looking at the ceiling. "Tired, but awake." He said, "Douglas came every day that first week. Did you know that?" I paused. "I know he came Saturday. He came Sunday too," Marcus said, "and Monday and Tuesday. He'd come in the morning, stay a few hours, leave. He didn't always come in when I was awake. Sometimes he just sat out in the waiting room. The nurse told me. He said he figured it helped you to have someone there." I stood in the doorway. "He also called Coach Martinez from my rec center," Marcus said. "Organized a meal train for when I got home. There are 17 meals in your freezer right now." I checked when we came through the kitchen. I hadn't opened the freezer. Marcus looked over at me. He said, "I asked him why he did all that." You know what he said? "What?" He said, "That's what people do when someone needs them." I had to look away for a moment. Out the window, at the backyard, at the oak tree I'd planted in 2006 that had gotten considerably taller than I expected. When I looked back, Marcus was still watching me. He said, quietly, in the careful voice of a son who has learned to choose his words, "Where was Sandra, Dad?" "Really?" I said, "She needed some air." He was still for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the same slow, certain nod I have been making my whole life, and apparently passed down without meaning to. He pulled his blanket up and closed his eyes. He said, "I have you." Pause. That's always been enough. He was asleep in 4 minutes. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking at my son, this 34-year-old man in the guest room of my house, who had nearly died on a job site in Aurora and who had come home to a meal train organized by a retired Corps engineer and a father who had learned, late and at some cost, to look clearly at the way the structure could and could not bear. I went to the kitchen. I made a pot of coffee I didn't need. I sat at the table, and I let the house be quiet around me. Claire Alderton and I met Wednesday of the following week. Sandra had retained an attorney by then, a man named Phil Garrett, competent, reasonable, not the kind who made things uglier than they needed to be. That helped. We are not in a war. That was never what I wanted. What I wanted was to stop pretending that presence was optional, to stop accommodating an accounting system that had been running at a deficit for years without my full awareness, to stop standing at the bottom of a staircase and hoping someone who had already made their decision might change it. The beneficiary change had been processed 4 days before I filed anything with Claire. The pension, the survivor benefit, the account that represented 32 years of federal service, no longer directed where it had directed for 22 years. It was a quiet change. It arrived in Sandra's awareness the way these things always arrive, through her attorney, through a document, through a specific bureaucratic language that makes things real in a way that conversations cannot. Phil Garrett called Claire the day after it was disclosed. I don't know what he said specifically. Claire told me the call lasted 11 minutes and was entirely professional. I appreciated that. Their proceedings ongoing. I will not detail them all here because some things require their privacy, and because the legal process is long and deliberate and does not move at the pace of story. What I can tell you is this. Marcus is recovered. He ran a 5K in May, 8 weeks after discharge, which Dr. Ferrant said was technically earlier than he recommended, but within the range of what he expected from a man with Marcus's stubbornness and presumably mine. He called me from the finish line. Douglas Webb has dinner at my house on the first Friday of every month now. I cook. He brings bad wine and good opinions on whatever I'm doing wrong in the backyard garden, and I accept both because that is the nature of a friendship that has lasted 34 years and shows no signs of stopping. The F-250 is still in the driveway. Sandra was right that it's too much truck for a man with no farm. I have decided I don't care. There is a specific kind of clarity that comes to a man when he stops managing the gap between what is true and what he prefer to believe. It doesn't arrive as a revelation. It doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives the way the best engineering assessments always arrive, quietly on paper, after you've looked at the numbers honestly and let them tell you what they say. I spent 32 years assessing structures. I should have looked closer at home. But I know this. The things built on honest foundations hold. The ones built on convenient fictions eventually show you the hairline fracture you never thought to inspect. Sandra said he has you. She wasn't wrong. She just didn't understand what having someone actually requires. Some people show up when it's easy. Some people show up when it costs them something. Make a note of which is which, and then make sure your documents reflect it. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Dad's Raw Revenge. I will see you on the next one.